Hey, Cynthia.
Yeah, hi Palesa, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. And hi, Teddy.
I understand that
Hi,
Teddy wants to
hi,
start.
Cynthia, Pervaiz, Palesa, Lee.
Thank you.
Hello, guys.
Do we have a formal introduction, Cynthia, or should we just jump in?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think people can read about Teddy Mattera in the abstracts and biographies. Yes. And he's going to start, he told us before that he was going to start with a selfie. So I think that will also give some idea of who he is. He's going to talk about when he was young, I think. And so I think maybe we should just let him go ahead into the selfie and then we'll start grilling him, right?
Right.
Okay. Well, so we'll mute ourselves and we'll hand over to you, Teddy.
Okay, I just think it's important to thank all the previous panelists and the guys who've organized, all of you, and an opportunity really. You know, I've listened to quite a number, if not all, of the panels that have been going on. Wow, you know, what a great contribution people are making to this construct and concept and reality of archive and the archive. Anyway, I want to take you back to my archive, you know, my personal archive. And it's from a small little chapter that I wrote as part of my PhD submission. I made a film, wrote a film called Waiting for Valdez, which Dumisani Phakathi, a South African director, directed of 24 minutes. Anyway, here it goes. It's called The Birth of the Film in the Maker, a selfie of my introduction to cinema. And I start with a quote from Cinema Paradiso, which says, "Whatever you end up doing, love it. The way you loved the projection booth when you were a little squirt." And that was my beginning. That's how cinema started for me, funnily enough. Johannesburg's western so-called colored township where I grew up was aptly named the Wild West because of the gun-slinging gangsters and violence endemic to this densely populated and economically impoverished community, which mirrored many other urban South African townships. As the residents of these locations, under the watchful eye of successive apartheid administrations, we were permitted bursts of anarchy where we could reap the destruction of internecine violence or participate in non-threatening demonstrations of joy, so long as neither act negatively impacted the relative ease and comfort in which our white counterparts lived just a short distance away. As children, life for us was simple. We knew nothing else, nothing better. We lived a seemingly happy existence in poverty, its ravages disguised for the most part by the charm of childhood endeavors, soccer in the dusty streets, daring games between oncoming traffic in peak hours, stealing from the Chinese traders and gorging on ripe peaches from white people's summer gardens, a welcome relief from the dodging pellets they fired at us as we ran away with our share of the spoils, the yummy fruits. Yet beneath this veneer of seemingly harmless frivolity hung the ever-present shroud of impending doom or danger. Going to cinema was no different to what happened on the streets. The same fate awaited us before, during, and after the Saturday double feature matinee at the local bioscope, where gangsters and rats preyed on our pockets and food, respectively. Rats and gangster life was synonymous in the township, so much so that you could not often distinguish one from another. While the gangsters gnawed at our very existence on the streets, the rats nibbled at our food on our favorite sandwiches made with oily mango pickled acha and sloppy chips, layered with thick slices of fresh white bread. Inside the cinema, row upon row of boys and girls sat, awestruck, their arms half stretched near their gaping mouths, with eyes glued to the exhilarating action on the screen. In the bioscope, life was magical. There was no apartheid, no grumpy parents, and certainly no school. Just you, the hero, and some bad guys caught in the realm of light and sound, and the rats, of course, who sometimes took a moment from our meals to look at the screen too. Life, however, was not always rosy. In the lean times, which were often, there was no money to eat, but less to go to the cinema, to watch popular films such as Valdez is Coming, starring Burt Lancaster, or Enter the Dragon with the inimitable Bruce Lee. We would pool our monies together and send two of the older boys from our street gang to watch the film in exchange for acha bread. They would return and around a fire drum, retell the film to us in hour-long episodes over a week. It was just like being at the cinema, and sometimes even better. We could ask the storytellers to rewind, fast forward, or even just pause and freeze, depending on how well they related the tale with all the sounds and visual effects added at our request. After all, we had paid for the service. The hierarchy was clear and accepted. The older boys narrated the action with exaggerated animation and embellished storylines, while the younger ones mouthed the soundtrack simultaneously, drumming his tummy or plucking his taut cheeks or whistling accordingly to these tense moments. As we grew older, each of us would get a chance to practice this artful skill. We narrated films in a unique urban street language, a colorful and spicy mixture of English, Afrikaans, isiZulu, Sesotho, which added a local flavor to filmic moments, such as Valdez's flashy gun draw or Bruce Lee's spectacular roundhouse kick. It was this very practice and orality that I used as one of my key points to structure the film Waiting for Valdez. Let me just cut into this. Looking back, and this is where the crux of my film, Cinema from Within, comes. Looking back, I question why we so easily identified with those on-screen heroes when we were obviously missing in the visual and oral narratives they played out. Absent were the characters who looked like us or spoke like we did. Perhaps we sought identification with them because these characters in those films, in some ways represented the all-powerful heroes and heroines in our immediate experience. After all, the men and women who lived like us or fought for justice were either banned or under house arrest or imprisoned or killed. Others was just simply absent in the lives of their children. Anyway, this is what I wanted to leave you with as an idea of where and how cinema came to me. You know, it's lived with me, you know, right up to now. And let me stop there. Thank you.
That was lovely, Teddy. Palesa, do you want to say something at this point, or?
I feel like it's really such a beautiful beginning because the film itself also starts there. It starts in that place where Teddy is almost trying to get us to be with him as a child, as the cinema bug kind of bites him, and what was happening and how, and then that kind of active translation. I think that the first thing that it gets me to think about is how cinema is collective. And like, and in the way that maybe one of your interviewees says, it's not like kind of grand. We're not talking about grand cinema. We're talking about those small moments where somebody's watched something and they're relaying it to somebody else in very simple terms. But you're saying out of that comes this really epic sort of relationship that you have with the art form and with the craft and with the history, etc. And it's also got me thinking about the act of translation. And I wonder how you've dealt with the difficulty of taking an art form that you constantly say sometimes is kind of your antimatter. It kind of gets in the way of your own sense of yourself. You and your father speak a bit about that, and that's one of the ways cinema's kind of interfered with African sort of identity, but then you take it and you try and do something with it. So I'm interested also in how you how you've taken the language and the form and inverted some things to try and get at something else, to try and restore yourself when you didn't feel represented by it. But it's a thought, it's just the beginning idea. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay.
I think that's a great point. Do you have a response, Teddy?
Can I let it simmer and then I'll come back to it? I think it's evocative. It kind of summons you to want to say something, and I think there's something else that's going on in that question that probably needs to cook a little bit, and I think I'll talk about it when we perhaps talk about the personal and the political, and how that translates into cinema practice, perhaps, Is that okay, Palesa?
Yes, it's completely okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it's completely okay. And also, Teddy, I was wondering if you had seen, and Cynthia, you'd seen the trailers that had come out of. It's like a set. It's like, I think it's on TikTok. These kids, I think they called the Ikorodu boys, if I remember correctly, and they're from Nigeria, and they redo the trailers of like big Netflix movies. And they recently got invited to Hollywood for what they did. And I think what you're saying reminds me a lot of that. And the Ghanaian posters, as we've seen as well, the kind of DIY way that maybe Africans or people in the South kind of take on Hollywood or take on sort of like a grand glamorous cinema and bring it into the vernacular of like a local vernacular. And I think that's what you're describing, Teddy, when you say that people would come home and they would tell you the story. And I'm interested in actually that this is a question, is like, did people embellish? What did that do for you? Was it like a kind of retelling of the story, but later you realize it wasn't the story, it was like there were like mistakes? Can you tell us about that moment?
I think that came like retrospectively, later on when I studied cinema formally, and I started looking back at how and when exactly, there's no real sort of pinpointed time when one could say this is when cinema started, because I remember that my father himself, he's an enthusiast of note, when it comes to cinema. I mean, he was the leader of a gang in Sophiatown, the Vultures, and they, as the film indicates, emulated Hollywood, in the way that they dressed and shaped social culture. I mean, Humphrey Bogart's famous sort of or notorious sort of line in one of his films was to live fast, die young, and have a good-looking corpse. And somehow I think some of that passes over quite invisibly into one's life and translates quite sort of organically, because you begin to emulate this kind of masculinity that you see that permeates through your father. Not that I became a gangster, but I kind of understood that there was something very magical about what I had understood about cinema, and because he used to take me to the movies in Fordsburg, in Johannesburg, and that's where this idea of how the personal and the political begins to connect, because he's also the person who kind of educated me around politics, right? So one gets a sense that the stories that you're watching and see later on in your life actually don't reflect who you are, because they don't depict your reality in a way. And so what you do is then you infuse yourself into that archive, however fictional it is, and you begin to raise questions around, well, where am I in this film? And if I'm not there, I'm going to put myself in it through my own language and where I live and through the people I know, in a way. So it then becomes a kind of a depiction of a possible reality in South Africa that was not realized at the time, but we were already living as children, because the brutality of apartheid has a strange kind of, there's something very beautiful about struggle, as painful as it is that it teaches one lessons about what's coming, in a way. And we can come back to that later on, because I think it speaks to where we are. If we want to know who we are right now, we've got to go back to that archive in a way. Let me stop there and let you.
Okay. But Teddy, I thought you were a gangster. Watching your film, you said you joined.
Yeah, well, no,
I was quite impressed.
Yeah, no, well,
when I was listening to your beautiful sort of poetic passage that you started off with, and yeah, so while you were watching your movies in the cinema in Westbury, or Western Native, I was, as you say in your piece, a few miles away only. I was also watching movies in my primary school hall in much more comfortable circumstances. It's quite strange to think about that. Probably the same movies even.
Sure.
Yeah, and as I've told you, I really loved your film and it made me cry, and that's because of our fathers. And as you know, people watching this might find this very unlikely, but actually Teddy and my father were very good friends. And my father was, they were both writers. My father didn't talk a lot. He wrote rather than speak, but he spoke about Don Mattera, and he used to tell us when we were children about how he had been banned, and we didn't really know what that meant. But just looking at my father, we realized, and we came to realize it was a very cruel punishment, especially for a writer. And later on, when I got the Star newspaper as an adult, then I met your dad again, and he adopted a very mentoring role towards me. He was very encouraging about my own writing. And then I also love that story that you have in your film about how he gave you 50 cents so you could get into the movie, and then someone attacked you with a bottle and you still bear a scar from it, and you had to hand in your bloody 50-cent piece, but the usher made you lick it clean. I love that story. So maybe just as a way of transitioning to Palesa's questions, talking about the personal and the political, maybe you could say something more about your father, more about what it was like to make the movie and have that footage of him. And as you say, I think in the movie, and I was very struck by it because I remember him as a very powerful man. I think that's the word you used in your film. And then we can see that he's aged, and it really tugs at your heart. So yes, I'd like to hear a bit about that.
It's interesting because one of the motif that I used to make this film, if one is to talk cinema language, is this notion of the prism, and looking at this triangular prism as a way to begin to interrogate identity. One knows that, from the scientific experiments that one did at school, when you shine a white light through a prism, it kind of bends the light and the different colors show up. There's your blue and whatever comes out. And I use that as a motif to speak about the personal, the political, and my film practice, and how intertwined those are, or how they are generated from the very sort of sense of what cinema means to me on that level. And so in relation to Don Mattera, my father, there's this kind of the three sort of aspects or elements of my that are discussed in this as a discourse in this film is precisely that, is that this is the very same person from whom I am born. It's also the same person who educates and schools me in Black consciousness, but he's also a writer. And so I followed the path of becoming a filmmaker. So there's this very interesting mix between us. We're friends at the same time, and he's a father, and then at the same time, we're fellow creatives. And so I think what happens in that process is you become schooled in a way that's very different from how the people and the men I grew up around were introduced to this notion of this masculinity. And as a result, what happens is you become that relationship between the personal and the political, and your outlook as a filmmaker gets shaped by how your relationships are kind of navigated, are what would one say? They are to some extent even sort of managed, you know. I found it interesting that we've got 3 generations of men in the story. We've got my son in it also, and I've named him after my father, Munnapula, which means man of the rain in Setswana. So what this experiment around, for example, masculinity does, and Black masculinity specifically in the context of Johannesburg and South Africa, and our family, who is almost the definitive mix, you know. I've got an Italian grandfather, I've got a Xhosa grandmother from my mother's side. We have, you know, sort of the white Matteras in Italy. So you get introduced quite quickly to this kind of multiplicities of who you are and how the personal and the political plays out in the apartheid context, and how cinema, the American cinema, informs some of that. And then the question is, how do you then articulate that experience into a film practice that begins to question the very things that you thought that make you up as a filmmaker? And that's the interrogation that this film does, and the people that I interviewed, the filmmakers, because we begin to address this question of representation and identification, and what those tropes actually begin to point to for us and make us question. Let me stop there, so because I can go on, as you can tell, you know.
And I think I think your film, you've touched on many things, and you're right, there's actually a lot to unpack, and a very broad conversation to be had. But I will try and maybe touch on very specific things because of the time. But I think one of the things that really does interest me is the layering that you are. I think in French the word essay means to try. That you're trying to put together. So, and I see your film as an essay film. I think it's like a kind of, it's like a thought attempt at kind of reconciling a lot of different ideas. One of which is this idea that you're offering, which is that a lot of how masculinity in South Africa at a certain period is imagined and performed migrates off of the screen, in terms of style, in terms of gesture. I mean, literally the idea that you're wearing a suit, but you're eating an apple. So it's the suit and the apple together. And if you eat an apple in front of someone, as your film puts forward, you're actually being an asshole. You're being questionable, if I may. So I think that what I'm interested in, though, and I'd like to ask you very specifically, maybe if you could touch on this idea of the migrating sort of masculine, the migration of like a masculine identity or an idea of what it means to be a man, and how it hits maybe your father, but also hits you specifically, because I think that's what your film is getting at. What I'd like to also ask is, as a man now, do you think that was enough? Did those images give you enough? What did they not give you? What did not migrate? And what then do you find those images did not give you, or they kind of left out, as you are then trying to be an actual 3D filmmaker, a male filmmaker in South Africa, etc. Do you understand what I'm asking? I guess it's a bit
I think I
all
do.
over the place.
All right, but please just sort of head me towards it as I make an attempt to answer or respond. Not answer, I think respond is more appropriate. You know, right at the beginning, it's uncanny in a way that my introduction to cinema happens to be spaghetti westerns, right? With white males and blue-eyed white males as heroes on one level, right? So check this out. And then my academic study points me to cinema in South Africa and the discovery of gold and diamonds happening simultaneously, right? So the first depiction of Black people on screen, because of how cinema is founded in this country, is of us in servitude, Black men in servitude. So the first images, the first few images that come out of the cinema from the mining houses is that of Black men in servitude.
Right.
We're always bowing down. We're always with the begging bowl. We're always being told where to go, how to dig. Tata lapa, pega lapa, bona lapa, nang. You understand what I'm saying? And on the other side is this idea of what our heroes are supposed to be, these blue-eyed sort of white men, right? So one's image of what masculinity represents is balanced finely between these two polarities. And that becomes the template of what cinematic representation of Black men become in cinema in South Africa. And you can see the progression happening as cinema increasingly develops in South Africa, you know, and how Black men are depicted. I will speak about how women are represented later after we make this point, because I think it's critically important. But let's just stick to the depiction and representation of Black men. So I find, if you ask me, the question, what touched me was when you asked me whether it would be enough, right? What is, so it's almost as if one begins to realize that there's a very sort of, there's a contagion here that's taking place psychologically. The apartheid mechanism feeds into the arsenal of cinema, right? And its psychology permeates through there, and it tells white filmmakers how to make films about Black people right up to today, by the way, right? It also tells Black filmmakers who they're supposed to be in constructing our representation. So these two dichotomous situations come to a clash in a way, where as a filmmaker for me, because suddenly you begin to realize that what you're caught up in is this notion that has been constructed well before you actually came into the realization of cinema, or you came into constructing your own images and ideas, right? And I find that for me is on this question of what is it about masculinities that drive a kind of particular way in which we look, say, for example, at Black women in cinema. You know, one of my interviewees remarks on this, and he says, you know, what you need to be in South Africa for a Black woman, an actress to be really good, is how good she can cry in South African cinema. Now, that is so painful. You know, it's not about the qualities and the merits that Black actresses have beyond being able to cry, but it actually speaks to the tragedy that has taken place. And I think one of the ways in which one begins to engage or interrogate this representation that seemingly is not enough to completely qualify who we are as Black men, or who I am as Black men, is by making certain conscious steps through making or being schooled by a figure like Don Mattera, because suddenly the connection between the personal and the political finds a home, right, in that relationship. Now, by no standards is, you know, this the sort of definitive Black men, but I'm talking in the context of the film, right? How one begins to use that construct and to create a different sense of what Black masculinity could be about. And I think it's more of an offering rather than saying this is the definitive kind of Black men rising that we need to see in terms of representation. So I'm not sure that I'm addressing some of what you're saying, but I think I'm speaking to how cinema has got its own particular way in which it constructs expectation. And the challenge for us is not to even deconstruct, but to recreate or reframe, to use the theme of this workshop, you know. How do you then speak to elements of cinema that are not even on the screen? How do you speak to changing the kind of masculinities that exist in our society through the work that you do. I choose to use cinema as a tool to educate young people about how to live, basically. Because I think if you can navigate a scene, it's possible that you might be able to navigate life itself. Okay, let me stop there.
Thanks, Teddy. I see we only have 5 minutes left, which is a real pity. I want to kind of follow, yeah.
I'm sorry.
No. It's just a pity because this is such a great conversation and so dynamic. And I just wanted to push you more on what Palesa is saying. Because I was thinking when I was in my primary school hall watching the same movies as you probably, I also identified with the heroes, and yet they were male. I didn't notice that either, And so what happens to us when one day we realize, oh dear, I'm black or I'm a girl? And I thought there must be a terrible emptiness while you try and think about not even reframing it, but what do you put in the frame instead?
Sure.
Do
you want to put that? Go for it, Palesa, please.
Yeah, I'm also, I suppose as we get into the last 4 minutes, Cynthia, you're right. I think we all have this kind of psychological relationship to the screen that we will side with the hero. I suppose the whole thing is designed to get you to side with the protagonist, and we know the operation of the gaze, we know the operation, the psychoanalytical sort of processes that go into making you align yourself with certain parts of the screen and not other parts. And we all, I think, can relate to that feeling of not being any more aligned, and therefore questioning what it is has formed your imagination of yourself and the world. But I think, Teddy, I'm interested finally if you can, what is interesting me, and it's a question that I think we might not get to the answer of, or in fact I don't even know how to ask the question, is if we are talking about, and you are yourself trying to get at how these images and these movements, these gestures, and this, like, how celluloid and the practice and the culture around cinema going, etc., forms you, frankly, as a man, as a son, as a friend, but also as like a person of the streets. Like, it forms you in very fundamental ways, and I think you're trying to get at that through your film. I'm interested in the question you have asked, which is, what are we doing now in our to be simplistic depiction and representation of masculinities in South Africa, on the continent, to try and address the ways that, like, the masculine forms itself now, or deals with itself now. And you have said it's about introducing the political to the personal. You're saying that the man must conceive of himself as a constant conversation between the political and the personal. And I'd like, maybe if you could reflect just a little bit in your practice now, in the film that you made, but also in other films, what is it do you do to the male characters, or to the relationships in those films? I know it's a big question that might bring us to a different way of reading masculinity than perhaps the one that you're offered by John Wayne, or even frankly by the protagonist in Mapantsula or Come Back Africa.
Teddy, you've got 2 minutes to answer this great question.
Let me just give it a shot. I put my son in the film, and I talk about one of the things that I tried experimentally in this film was to try and engage or engross myself with what I call an invisibilized or invisible presence, or a silent presence. And my son appears next to me in this film, and he's been on many shoots with me since he was, I think, 1. He's appeared in Shame. I think by the time I get the invoice from him, it's going to be huge, But he appears in all these films that I've made, and he's watched me make films, and he's watched how I've engaged with partners on my way. And we have this constant conversation between us about what the issues are that he will be confronted with. As a young black man growing up. He's 10 years old now. Already the questions are coming in from him at school. You know, are you so-called colored? Are you black? Your mom is from the Congo, but she lives in Switzerland, etc., etc., etc. And it comes back to the very fundamental thing, which is, how do you begin to enable or create an environment that is enabling for this young man to be able to be the best young man that he could be, in relation to the society that he lives in. So questions around how do you treat and how do you be with women, the young women at your school? How do you translate that? What kind of stories do you hear or do you want to tell about? He wants to be a filming pilot, by the way. So I don't know, that's a, you know, another story. He wants to fly drones, you know, in space somewhere, I don't know. But I think the point about it is that he has an opportunity which I never had, in a way. You know, my dad took me to the cinema and he introduced me to things and aspects. But what I didn't have, in a way, that my generation was to be able to ask questions, to be able to be permitted to engage with your masculinity at a very early age and what it means for you. And maybe you don't really understand that notion when you are a kid growing up, because you're not a man and you're not sure what masculinity means, but in some way you allow for that cartographical experience, the exploration of it, to take place. And I don't know, Palesa, I think it will take a long time for me. I don't even know the answer to this. I'm just really just giving you a heartfelt response more than something that's deeply intellectual, you know.
I think we appreciated the heartfelt response, and you're being spared from having to answer any more because we've come to the end of our time. So thanks very much, Teddy. It was a fantastic conversation. And thanks, Palesa.
Can you bring me in to say goodbye?
Great.
Thank you so much, Teddy.
No?
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And now I think that Pervaiz wants to have a few words. Just before he does, I'd just like to say thank you very much to Pervaiz. He's a great collaborator. I can't believe that we've worked on Reframing Africa for 4 or 5 years and we still have never shouted at each other. But thanks, Pervaiz. Over to you.
Yes. Look, thank you very much for a very thoughtful and inspiring conversation. Yes. I mean, you know, the whole weekend has been inspiring, and I think this is a very good way to round it off, because the starting point for where we've come from is to say that, you know, we are not outside cinema. Yes, here in Africa, we have been part of it since its very inception. And what Teddy points out is that gold was discovered, cinema arrived, and there has been this economic and political relationship, economic, political, social, cultural relationship between cinema and economy. And the very nature of what we've been looking at is cinema in that context, not just cinema because of the love of it, but I know that everybody who's taken part in the weekend as presenters, yes, and panelists loves cinema. But that isn't enough. Cinema can play another role, yes, a role which opens us up to our humanity, and that makes us question, yes, and makes us reflect and question and create images which inspire people, images which fire people, yes, and that's a responsibility that I think we all carry with us, yes, in different sorts of ways. And we've talked about Osman Semben. We've had a younger generation of filmmakers who've taken part, and I'm very, very grateful. I mean, obviously, from a perspective of being the co-convenor, you know, one organizes things. I have the great, you know, luxury of being involved in organizing something which I'm passionate about. And as I was saying to our team here, Bahir, Hanky, Chamisa, who's had to leave at the start yesterday morning, that everybody else who's also taking part believes that we can play a role in the world. We can't do everything, yes, but we can do something. And the culture is not just, you know, something that's as an afterthought in terms of the society we live in, the times we live in. And thank you everybody who's taken part. Yes, obviously this is a dialogue, even if it's a slightly, you know, mediated dialogue, more than we have usual. Yes, we couldn't have had this happen without the people who've logged on, and this will become available. People will be able to watch this and we'll share it. And also for another week or so, till next weekend, all the material that's on the Vimeo will carry on being available. So if you haven't had a chance to watch it, please do. and feel free to share it with other people. Yes, because that's why it's been put there. Yes, so thank you very much.
May I add and may I encourage whoever's watching to please watch if you haven't seen Teddy's film. It's a really it's a really provocative film.
Yeah, and it also touches me because I haven't watched that many of Teddy's films, but I know Teddy through the film.
Yeah.
Yes, better, and we got to know each other over the last few years, but I think it actually carries something for all of us. I know that one of my colleagues, comrades, Reece Auguiste, when I told him before he got to watch it about that, he said that's exactly what we used to do in Dominica. Yes, in the Caribbean, a couple of us would be given the money and go in to watch the film and tell everybody else. Then I have my elders, Sivanandan, who race and class, which Teddy knows the journal. He was very influenced by watching Westerns. He said Westerns and reading Westerns. He said it was very clear, the good guys, the bad guys, even if you were seen as being the Indians. Yes, so there's metaphors, So the key thing is, thank you everybody for taking part. And watch out, we will be doing things throughout the year. Yes, and those we have an emailing list from all of this, so we'll remind everybody to share. Thank you, go well, enjoy what's left of your weekends.